Just a little bit of interesting trivia. I haven't been in this room for about 15 or 16 years. The last time I was here was with my former boss, who was the Commissioner of State Lands at the time, and we were releasing an 1868 report, which was a compilation of surveys that had been done by Arkansas's first land commissioner, and his office was actually in this room in this building, so I feel kind of a connection here. I'm really honored to be here today. It is my privilege and responsibility as Director of Programs to talk about the legacy of Winthrop Rockefeller, who was a remarkable public servant and even more remarkable human being. And unfortunately, although his name is very famous, a lot of people don't know very much about him. So I'm here today to kind of illuminate his story for you and to walk you through the history of Winthrop Rockefeller from his early life to his untimely death in 1973. And mostly I'm going to focus on what shaped him as a man and what was important to him, what his values were, and how that really impacted our state. I want to thank Leah Lambert for coordinating my appearance here today, and George Ann Cisco, Bill Gatewood, the director of the Old State House, and everybody who made this possible, because we love to tell the story of Winthrop Rockefeller. Some of my colleagues from the Institute are here today, and I'm just happy to be able to share this with them and with you. So before I begin, I just want to point out that for those of you who are historians, there is very little, remarkably little, information that's been written about Governor Rockefeller, especially in his early years. There are 3 books that are in publication in Arkansas, from both of them written by Arkansans. One is by Kathy Kunziger Irwin, who did her thesis and dissertation on Winthrop Rockefeller at Notre Dame. She transformed that into a book called Agenda for Reform, and it's a really good objective look at Winthrop Rockefeller's time as governor in Arkansas. So if you want to kind of dig into his platform, his policies, his relationship with the legislature, Kathy's book is a really good place to start. And then John Ward, the late John Ward of Conway, was Winthrop Rockefeller's campaign manager and press secretary. He's written 2 books about Winthrop Rockefeller, one called The Arkansas Rockefeller, which kind of, again, gives you an inside look at the campaign and Winthrop Rockefeller's time in Arkansas. And then he also chronicles all of the philanthropic gifts that Winthrop Rockefeller made to the state, which are still to this day making an impact in the lives of Arkansans. In addition to those 3 books, we have the fortune in this state to have the University of Arkansas at Little Rock's Center for Arkansas History and Culture, and their Winthrop Rockefeller archives, which are housed just down the street, and we have a representative from the archives with us today. We rely on the archives extensively. There are about 2,000 boxes of documents and videos and photographs and memorabilia of Winthrop Rockefeller, and it's a treasure trove for us. And you know, a lot of people, what we've learned is that they've been largely unused. So we're still discovering the story of Winthrop Rockefeller, and I encourage you, if you're a historian who's interested in learning more about him, that you visit the archives in downtown Little Rock. We also have 2 manuscripts that were written by Winthrop Rockefeller himself. One is called A Letter to My Son, and he wrote it for Winthrop Paul Rockefeller to kind of give Win Paul an insight into who he was as a man and what had shaped him in his early years. And it's from that letter that I draw a lot of what I'm going to share with you today. He also has an unpublished and probably would be considered unfinished manuscript about his time on the mountain and his decision to get into politics. And so all of those sources are really helpful for us in understanding Governor Rockefeller's legacy and his story. The one exciting thing that I'd like to mention is that also at UALR, the Distinguished Professor of History and the director of the Joel E. Anderson Center for Race and Ethnicity, Dr. John Kirk, is working on a full-length biography of Winthrop Rockefeller. It will be the first one of its kind, and we are anxious for him to finish that. But our observations and conversations with Dr. Kirk also have informed us greatly about his story. Forgive me, because I'm getting over, like everyone else in Arkansas, some kind of thing from the pollen, so I may be kind of gravelly today. I apologize for that. Before I begin, I want to recognize Dr. Marta Lloyd. She's the executive director of the Winthrop Rockefeller Institute. She has a fierce commitment to Winthrop Rockefeller's legacy, and like the rest of us, loves to tell the story. Marta's here with us today, and we appreciate her leadership. So, all right, well, let's get started here. And also want to thank Daniel for setting me up with my technology. I hope I don't mess it up. So, okay. Well, Winthrop Rockefeller's story starts where all of our stories start, with his family of origin, his mother, his father, and his siblings. But unlike the rest of us, most of the rest of us anyway, Winthrop Rockefeller was born into an incredibly famous and mind-bogglingly wealthy family. People who don't know very much about Winthrop Rockefeller, when they learn he was governor of Arkansas, will often ask, was he that Rockefeller? Yes, he was. Winthrop was born the fourth son and the fifth child of John D. Rockefeller Jr. and Abby Aldrich Rockefeller. His mother, Abby, was the daughter of Senator Nelson Aldrich from Rhode Island, so by her own rights came from a very wealthy and powerful political family. John D. Rockefeller Jr., of course, was the only son of John D. Rockefeller Sr., who was the founder of Standard Oil and the country's first billionaire. There has been so much written about John D. Rockefeller Sr., about the building of Standard Oil and about the immense family fortune that they amassed. And as a consequence, there's a lot of speculation about the Rockefeller family. People are always curious. They want to know how they lived, how much money they had, what it was like to be a Rockefeller. And those are all interesting questions. But I think what's more important than the money, and certainly what influenced Winthrop more than just the family fortune, was what we call the Rockefeller ethic. It was that was passed down from John D. Sr. to John D. Jr. and to his children. And that ethic encompasses a philosophy on life about giving back to others. John D. Sr. was a very devoutly religious man. He believed in the parable of the faithful servant, to whom much is given, much is required. And he instilled that same philosophy in his children, that the God-given talents that he had, the fortune that he was able to amass, was to be used to lift other people out of poverty, to educate people, to provide health care, to provide social justice in this country. And that ethic was passed down from one generation to the next. The primary way that, beyond just the philanthropy, that the Rockefellers embraced this ethic was by believing that there was no problem that was too insurmountable for them to solve, not simply because of their fortune, but because they believed in the power of people. If you bring the experts, the scholars, the thinkers, the best minds together to try to solve what seems to be an insurmountable problem, then you've got it licked. And the Rockefellers did that, yes, by using their incredible fortune, but also because they believed in advancing society together. And so those values were passed down from John D. Jr. to his sons and his daughter. This is a picture of Winthrop with John D. Jr. He says, "I learned when I was a boy in New York that I would always have some special responsibility for helping others help themselves." And he learned that from a very young age. What was interesting about the Rockefeller children is that although they were certainly comfortable, they didn't live a life of luxury necessarily. In fact, in a letter to my son, Winthrop says his allowance from his father was meager. And that was true for all of the children. One thing that John D. Jr. and Sr. shared in common was a scrupulous method of bookkeeping. They believed, despite the fact they had more money than anyone in the United States, they believed in accounting for every dollar that was spent and for understanding where one's money went. Unfortunately, Winthrop was not terribly good at that. It wasn't that he didn't care, he just wasn't good at bookkeeping, unlike his father and his grandfather. In fact, there are many accounts, both from his brothers and from Winthrop himself, that he was afraid of those conversations that he would have with his father about what he had done with his money. The children were able to supplement their paltry allowances by having a garden plot. This picture on the right is, I think this is Winthrop. We're never sure sometimes, but the boys are all about 2 years apart. But they're watering the garden there, and he mentions in a letter to my son that he sold produce from his garden plot in order to supplement his allowance. Winthrop's mother Abby was very concerned with human relations. She believed in the power of relationships with people, in getting to know and understand another person and having respect for them. She also wanted the children to learn how to be grateful and be appreciative of the work that other people did for them. And so, as a consequence, She required the boys and Abby both to work in the kitchen. They learned how to cook, some with success, others less so. But they learned how to be self-sufficient, and they learned how to respect the work that other people did for them. I love this quote from Winthrop: "The conviction that every person who did his work well was entitled to the fullest respect as an individual was always a fundamental part of the beliefs mother and father imparted to us." And you'll see that throughout Winthrop's life, that even though he is a billionaire, he really relates to the common man, and particularly those people who work with their hands and who create and build things. And we'll get to that in a minute. Actually, we'll get to that now. So Winthrop was not, in addition to not being a great bookkeeper, he was also not a very good student. He went to school in his early years at the Lincoln School, which was an experiential learning program that was sponsored by Columbia State Teachers College. He did fairly well there because a lot of things were hands-on. But as he approached his high school years, his academic performance was less than satisfying. So his father and mother sent him to Loomis, which is a college preparatory school in Connecticut. He struggled mightily at Loomis. He did not make good marks. He required a lot of tutoring, which his parents provided for him, in order to be admitted to Yale. He did attend Yale for 2 years. His marks there were not good either. And frankly, he didn't enjoy being a student. Now, what we know from later accounts is that Winthrop probably had dyslexia. He was not diagnosed at the time. I'm not even sure we knew then what dyslexia was, but he struggled. And he must have found a way to overcome that later in life because of the writings and the information that we see that he produced later. But he wasn't an academic, didn't want to be. And so in 1934, after he had spent a summer in Houston with the Humble Oil Company, he decided that he wanted to go work in the oil fields. Not in the oil business, in the oil fields. And his father, John D. Jr., was proud of him and said, you know, this is great. I mean, he wants to learn the oil business from the ground up. Winthrop said, I wanted to live on what I could earn rather than on my last name. And so he took off. Here he is as a young man in Texas. First he was a roustabout, which basically meant that he had to do whatever jobs he was assigned on the oil drilling company or with the oil drilling company. Sometimes that was digging a ditch, sometimes it was hauling heavy equipment. He learned a lot about the technology of drilling oil. He learned a lot, he says in a letter to my son, about leadership, about what it means to work alongside men in the field, and how he proved to them that he was one of them. Initially, some of the guys in the oil field were really suspicious of Winthrop Rockefeller. You know, what's he doing here? He could have a corner office and an air-conditioned room somewhere. But Winthrop proved that to them that he was sincere about wanting to learn what they knew, work alongside them. He proved he would do any job that they would do. And over time, he earned their respect and their camaraderie. In a letter to my son, he talks about how the years that he spent, and there were 3 years total that he spent working in the oil fields, first as a roustabout, then as a roughneck, doing the dangerous work of drilling. He calls those some of the happiest years of his life. However, being a Rockefeller, it wasn't in the cards for him to work in a manual labor position for the rest of his life. And so after his stint with the Humble Oil Company in Houston, he came back home to New York. And he was there for a few years trying to find his place in the family. One of the things that he was encouraged to do by his older brothers is to go to work for the Greater New York Fund. At the time, there were a number of charitable organizations that were working in New York City to try to advance the causes of social justice, but on their own, they weren't able to raise enough money to do the things they wanted to do. And so the Greater New York Fund was established, and Winthrop became its chair for its fundraising committee and raised about $4 million in his first effort. His father and his brother were very proud of him, and that was really the first glimpse that we see toward Winthrop's involvement in philanthropy. He also, when he came back from the oil fields, became a trustee and remained a trustee for the Urban League, the National Urban League. And so, again, that's kind of an early glimpse into his interest in civil rights and social justice. Before he enlisted in the Army, as you can see here, Winthrop had gone to work for Socony Vacuum Oil, which was the predecessor to ExxonMobil, and he was assigned as an international development liaison for the oil company. So he spent a lot of time in the Middle East, he spent a lot of time in Italy, and this was all around the late 30s and early 40s. So he understood and really began to see the kinds of tensions that were happening in Europe around World War II. He also got a glimpse into the cultural divisions that were happening in the Middle East. And it really, I think, informed his later views about how we need to all be tolerant of one another. How if we don't do a better job of understanding each other, that violence will ensue. He was so worried about that, in fact, that he came home and in January of 1941, he enlisted as a private in the Army. This was January of 1941, before Pearl Harbor. He knew that the United States was likely to be involved in World War II. He came home, he enlisted as a private, first member of his family to enlist in the Army, the only member to enlist before the war. He was sent to Fort Benning, Georgia for his training. After several months and after we had become involved in World War II, he was sent to the Philippines and to Guam and saw significant action in the Pacific Theater. It was during the Battle of Okinawa, the invasion of Okinawa, that he was on the troop ship USS Enrico that was hit by a kamikaze pilot. All of the commanding officers on that ship were killed or severely wounded, except for Winthrop Rockefeller. He did sustain flash burns to his hands and to his head. He was wounded, but he maintained control and order on the ship until reinforcements could arrive. And for his service there, this is another picture of him in the Philippines. For his service there, he was awarded the Bronze Star with oak leaf clusters and the Purple Heart. He rose in the ranks in the Army from a private to a lieutenant colonel. He was in the Army from 1941 to 1947. He became a member of the Infantry Officer Hall of Fame at Fort Benning, Georgia. Unfortunately, we don't know a lot about Winthrop's feelings about the war or his experiences there. Like so many of the greatest generation, he didn't want to talk about it. Even in a letter to my son, he doesn't cover his time spent in World War II. However, at the Institute, we were very fortunate a few months ago to get to know a man whose father had served with Winthrop in the Pacific Theater. In fact, Winthrop and this man had become so close after having shared their experiences in wartime that Winthrop took care of this man's family after he died. And the kids were very close to him. They called him Uncle Win. And we got to read some of the letters that he shared with this other gentleman who was his friend. And that was our real, first glimpse into what kind of psychological damage that the war could inflict and did inflict on the young men of that generation. It was very difficult to come back and reacclimate. Now, it was difficult for everyone in the greatest generation. Imagine how difficult it was for Winthrop Rockefeller. Yes, he had a lot of money. He was from a wealthy and powerful family. Here you can see the brothers. By this time, the Rockefeller brothers have started to assume control of the family business and philanthropy. And Winthrop comes home from the war, wounded, with a lot of experiences that he's not really willing to share. And he doesn't have a path that he's set out for himself in life, like some of the rest of the brothers. David was the financier, and Nelson was the politician. Lawrence was involved in charitable work. John D. had taken over, John D. III had taken over for his father. And Winthrop was always sort of in the middle somewhere, never really understanding exactly what his calling was to be. And so when he came home, it was a difficult adjustment period for him. In a letter to my son, he writes that he learned to smoke while he was at Loomis, but he didn't learn to drink until he was at Yale. He says, when I learned to drink at Yale, I was not very good at it. I could only have about 3 drinks and then I would be deathly ill. The next sentence says, unfortunately, I later got over that. Here he was, this young, handsome, accomplished, extraordinarily wealthy man. He's come back to New York. He's part of the Cafe Society, and he can't stay out of the press. I mean, imagine he's a Rockefeller. It's just like today. The press is covering every move that he makes. He has a whirlwind courtship in 1948 with this stunning model and actress of Lithuanian descent named Barbara Sears. Everybody called her Bobo. Bobo and Winthrop were married on Valentine's Day in 1948. And soon after, their son Winthrop Paul was born, Winthrop Rockefeller's only biological child. But unfortunately, the marriage was not going to last. Winthrop and Bobo separated soon after Winthrop's birth, and several years later they were divorced. So that earned him some publicity that his parents weren't necessarily proud of, and he had a hard time escaping the negative media attention. So briefly, before the next chapter in his story, he will go to work for his brother Lawrence's International Development Corporation, which is it's called IBEC, and it's actually meant to help foster sustainable development in third world countries. And so he goes to Puerto Rico for a little while, helps to build about 9,000 housing units in Puerto Rico as part of this effort. And then a buddy from Little Rock, who he had served with in the war, calls him up and says, "Why don't you come and visit me in Arkansas?" And it was at that moment that Winthrop's life took a turn permanently for the better and helped define who he was going to be for the rest of his life. He fell in love when he came to Arkansas, this time with the state, with the beautiful natural resources, mostly with Petit Jean Mountain. He says, in the summer of 1953, as I walked over the land that would become Windrock Farms, the problems ahead of me were obscured by my dream. He wanted to live on Petit Jean, and I think because he spent a lot of time with his family growing up on their estate in Poncanico Hills in New York, in Kykuit, the mansion that his father and grandfather had helped to build. He spent his summers in Maine, in Seal Harbor, and his father actually had him out in the summer helping him build carriage roads in what would become Acadia National Forest. He loved working with his hands. He was a builder at heart, and when he saw Petit Jean, he saw an opportunity to create a space, much like his fathers had saw opportunities to create spaces of their own. And so he built his estate on top of Petit Jean Mountain and set about to build a model cattle farm. What he wanted to do was he wanted to show how cattle farming could be successful in the South, how sustainable agricultural practices and technology and innovation could really elevate farming in Arkansas. He brought Santa Gertrudis cattle to Petit Jean Mountain, and while he was building the farm, people in Conway and Perry counties were not so sure about Winthrop Rockefeller. They were glad to have a Rockefeller in their midst, but they thought it was probably unlikely he'd be able to make that farm work. I mean, after all, the mountain rises almost 1,000 feet from the Arkansas River. There was no water on the mountain. The soil was very rocky. The land was forested. It just didn't look like a cattle pasture. But Winthrop was not to be deterred. And I want to take you back to his boyhood for just a second, because in the building of Windrock Farms, we get a glimpse of who Winthrop Rockefeller is going to become and how he's going to change Arkansas. When he was a young boy, he realized that he could capture the rays of sun with his flashlight lens and print on wood. And so he took this poem by Edgar Guest called "It Couldn't Be Done," and he burned this poem into a piece of fresh plywood which would later hang in his office. He told Win Paul in a letter to my son that this was the most true and honest piece of philosophy that he had ever come across in his life. And I know you can read it, but I'm going to read it as well. Somebody said that it couldn't be done, but he, with a chuckle, replied that maybe it couldn't, but he would be one who wouldn't say so till he'd tried. So he buckled right in with a trace of a grin on his face, and if he was worried, he hid it. He started to sing as he tackled the thing that couldn't be done, and he did it. You have to love some poetry to burn it into a piece of wood. This was the motto for his life. This was the motto for his life. You see this here, they're laying the pipe to come bring water up the mountain to Petit Jean. And sure enough, Winthrop Rockefeller did it. He established Windrock Farms, which is still thriving to this day, albeit under slightly different structure. But he wanted to prove that he could do it, and he did. Now, there was someone who took notice that there was a Rockefeller in our midst, and that was Governor Orville Faubus. I have to point out that although Winthrop fell in love with the state of Arkansas, he was quite intelligent and had a really good intuition and business acumen. And he knew that even though this was a land of opportunity and much potential, it was also a state with enormous challenges. Racial strife, segregation of schools, a massive inferiority complex, as he says, and a hillbilly image that had been foisted upon us by outsiders, and frankly, we hadn't done a good job of overcoming it ourselves. The state was mostly agrarian, mostly farmland. We hadn't transitioned to that industrialized economy yet, and Winthrop saw the opportunity. He knew that we could be great. He knew that we could prosper if only we would invest in ourselves. But we couldn't invest in ourselves until we had jobs. And Governor Orville Faubus convinced the legislature in 1955, right after Winthrop arrived, to form the Arkansas Industrial Development Commission. And obviously, they morphed into the Arkansas Economic Development Commission, but their charter was to help the state transition to an industrialized economy. And Governor Faubus thought, with the magic name of Rockefeller, the network of connections, and the family fortune, surely he would be the right person to chair the first AIDC. And so Governor Faubus appointed Winthrop Rockefeller as chair of the commission. And this is where the Rockefeller ethic comes into play. I want to mention before I get into that is we can't tell the story of Windrock Farms without talking about Jimmy Hudson. Jimmy Hudson was Winthrop Rockefeller's dear friend from New York. He came here with him to Arkansas the first time he traveled here, and Winthrop asked him to move to Petit Jean Mountain to manage Windrock Farms. Now, what's significant about that is that Jimmy Hudson was black. Winthrop didn't matter to him, certainly mattered to a lot of people in Conway County at the time. The racial attitudes in the state were less than desirable. And it was hard for Jimmy. It was very hard for him. But he helped to make Windrock Farms successful. And so I always want to talk about Jimmy as we talk about the story. Winthrop, as he built the farm and got settled, also married Jeanette Edris. This was his second marriage. This was several years after he had left New York. Jeanette brought with her 2 children who would become Winthrop's stepdaughter and stepson, and they spent time with him on the mountain, as did his son, Win Paul. Even though Win Paul grew up in different places around the globe, really, went to boarding school in Europe, he always came home to Petit Jean to spend time with the family, and thankfully Winthrop Paul would also choose Arkansas. He didn't have to, but he did. He made his home on Petit Jean after his father left. So we fast forward to the Industrial Development Commission. Winthrop Rockefeller was named as chair. He served for 9 years in that capacity, and this is where the Rockefeller ethic comes into play, because Winthrop knew that this challenge of transitioning from an agrarian economy to an industrial one was not insurmountable. We just had to get the right people in the room to talk about it. So he brought experts, he brought scholars, he brought thinkers, he brought policymakers and business leaders from the state to consider how we can bring Arkansas into the 20th century. And it was there on Petit Jean Mountain, as a result of these collaborative meetings, that the Arkansas Industrial Development Commission wrote the state's first economic development plan. And Winthrop Rockefeller helped to execute it. After 9 years, there were 600 new industries in Arkansas, 90,000 new jobs, and the average wage of the Arkansan was rising. We had lost more than 8% of our population 2 decades before, and thanks to the work of the Industrial Development Commission and Winthrop Rockefeller, we were on a new path forward. The only problem with this story, I mean, we could stop there and just talk about Winthrop Rockefeller's role with economic development, but he knew that that wasn't enough. Rockefeller money, Rockefeller energy, a great economic development plan was not going to be enough to elevate Arkansas and help us reach the potential that he knew that we had. What was holding us back, in addition to all of those attitudes that we talked about earlier, was the fact that we were a solidly one-party state, corrupt one at that in many places. And so Winthrop Rockefeller knew that unless he challenged the democratic political machine in Arkansas, there was really no hope of changing policy, changing state government, changing attitudes of people. That was a big job, because Winthrop Rockefeller's family, Nelson in particular, who he's with in this picture, were Republicans, which was not, at that time in Arkansas, the way to get elected. Not only were they Republicans, but they were progressives. They were what people in Arkansas in the 1960s called liberal New York Republicans. So the idea that Winthrop Rockefeller could create this other party was a little absurd at first. But remember that poem. If you say it can't be done, he's going to do it. So Winthrop thought a lot. He says in his manuscript, with no alternatives, there are no challenges. And with no challenges, there's no change. What he wanted to bring to Arkansas was a challenge to people's thinking, a challenge to the status quo. How can we do things differently? And so he set about establishing the first Republican Party in Arkansas. Now, the Republicans had a party before that. They were not very well organized. Their platform wasn't terribly persuasive, and we only had a few of them elected to offices of import. Winthrop began recruiting candidates. He began trying to build county organizations. And Governor Faubus, of course, got wind of that. In fact, Governor Faubus heard about the Committee on Two Parties that Winthrop had formed and brought to Petit Jean Mountain to figure out how we could make a two-party system in this state. And for Winthrop, it was less about the party label and more about just creating that alternative, something that people could look at to decide, where do we want to go in the future? So it was quite a challenge. In 1964, the first year that Winthrop decided to challenge Governor Orville Faubus, his brother Nelson was on the Republican ticket in the primary election running against Barry Goldwater. At that time, Arkansans were not in support of a liberal New York Republican over Barry Goldwater, let me put it that way. And so this idea that this New York Republican, this person with progressive liberal views, would come in and build this alternative party seemed to be insurmountable. But he knew, and people around him knew, that he was the only one with a chance to challenge the Faubus machine. So he ran in 1964. His campaign wasn't terribly well organized in 64. He ended up losing by about 14 points to Governor Faubus. But on the day after the election, his campaign started again for 66. That defeat in 1964 was the challenge in Edgar Guest's poem. Somebody said it couldn't be done. And Winthrop was ready at that point to put his heart and his soul into running for governor of Arkansas. And so in 1966, in January, he announced that he would run again against Governor Faubus for the Republican nomination and for governor of Arkansas. Governor Faubus decided in March that he would not seek re-election after 12 years in office. And so the field on the Democratic side was wide open. His opponent, Winthrop's opponent, in the 66 election was Justice Jim Johnson, who was a staunch segregationist from South Arkansas. Even though he was a Democrat, and that certainly favored him in terms of Arkansas voter perceptions, his racial rhetoric was very divisive, and it gave Winthrop Rockefeller the opportunity to really introduce himself to Arkansas and how he saw this future success for the state. One of the interesting things about the 66 campaign is that it was a very sophisticated campaign in terms of technology. Winthrop Rockefeller and his team leased an IBM 1401 computer. Look at that monster. And a printer. This enabled them to create this first computerized voter list in Arkansas. And thanks to their research and the compilation of that data, they were able to personalize and mail over 1,000 letters, over 1 million letters to Arkansas voters, direct mail. And that was kind of the beginning of the direct mail campaign successes because they could reach out individually to each voter. They were a woman, whether they were a man, whether they were black, whether they were white, and say, this is who I am. I am Winthrop Rockefeller, and here's what I believe we can do to change the state. So they launched this sophisticated campaign. They also made sure that their campaign organization was out there kind of monitoring voting irregularities. This was a big problem also in the 60s, as many of you may remember from the history books. And so really bringing kind of a professional campaign perspective and bringing integrity to elections was part of that campaign mantra. And then also, as important as those two things, is that Winthrop launched a grassroots campaign to connect with voters. What many people don't know about Winthrop Rockefeller is that he was painfully shy, at least for speaking in public. He didn't enjoy it. But he had this way of connecting with people. He was an imposing presence. He was tall. He always wore a cowboy hat. He was from New York. He was a Rockefeller. This little girl here on the right, I think that's how some of us feel sometimes when we're thinking about his legacy and trying to perpetuate it. He was just a giant. But he did a good job of getting out and traveling around the state, connecting with people, helping them to see, just like those men in the oil fields saw, all those years ago that he was ready to roll up his sleeves. He was ready to go to work, and he was one of them. And by this time, he had lived in the state over 10 years, and people started to think Winthrop Rockefeller might be the answer. And so in 1966, he was elected governor of Arkansas. He was sworn in on January 10th, 1967, Arkansas's first Republican governor since 1874. Here's a picture of the receiving line outside the governor's mansion, 1967. Now, Winthrop, in 1967, went to the Capitol with this idea about reforming state government. Because not only had there been a corrupt political machine in Arkansas, but Governor Faubus had been in office for 12 years. He had a number of political appointees entrenched all around state government. Boards and commissions were independent and not really willing to listen to the direction of the new governor. And he had a legislature with 135 members, and only 3 of them were Republican. Not only that, but for many years, their only election had been in the primary. They never had a Republican opponent until Winthrop Rockefeller came along and began to build up county organizations and recruit candidates. And then suddenly, many of them were facing opponents in their general election. And so they were none too happy about this Rockefeller that had come to Arkansas and tried to establish a Republican Party, and now suddenly was assuming the governorship. So the Senate in particular was very much of an obstacle to Winthrop. They didn't want to confirm his political appointees. They did pass some of the legislation that he proposed, and probably, arguably, his first session was more successful than the other. In the beginning, his platform was about education reform. He was able to institute a state-supported kindergarten, to allow for free textbooks in schools, and to have a modest increase in teacher pay. All of those were very important reforms for the state at the time. He worked on highway safety and strengthening the regulations of the state's insurance industry. At that time, we had more insurance companies per capita operating in Arkansas than New York did, and the insurance department was a little, in some ideas, or some people's ideas, soft on regulation. So Winthrop strengthened their regulatory responsibilities. One of the main things that he attacked in that first term was prison reform. The only thing that had been more of an embarrassment to Arkansas than our civil rights stance in the 1957 desegregation crisis was the fact that our prisons were in such terrible condition. And it had made national news on several different occasions. So Winthrop put together a study committee to look at how to improve prison conditions in Arkansas. And while that didn't all come to fruition in his first term, it was getting that study commission put together that helped bring about some badly needed improvements in prisons in the late 60s. He also passed the state's first FOI law and tried his best to institute more transparency in government. One of the things that Winthrop Rockefeller believed is that political patronage was not a bad thing as long as you had qualified people in office. Unfortunately, we didn't always have qualified people in positions, and so he set about recruiting extremely qualified personnel to come and help administer the state's chief government services. The flip side of that is that Arkansas didn't pay their state employees very much. Most people from New York or Texas or other places who had experience in government administration didn't want to come to Arkansas for the salary that we could offer, so Winthrop Rockefeller supplemented their incomes with his own personal fortune. Now, that's charitable, and it was a good thing in many ways for Arkansas, but it really raised the ire of the Arkansas legislature. Because if you think about it, someone with not so good motives supplementing the salaries of public servants is a problem with perception, and sometimes more than just perception, it's reality. So he looked at and tried to reform state government, tried to professionalize it, tried to make it more transparent. He spent a lot of time in his office on Winrock Farms. This is a picture that I love, mostly because of this sign right here that says improvement. But he spent a lot of time on Petit Jean, still employing that Rockefeller ethic, still trying to get people to collaborate to solve problems. And unfortunately, because of his time away from the Capitol and the time spent on the mountain, he was criticized pretty roundly, especially in the 68 and 70 election by the Democratic legislature and others who said that he was an absent governor. He ran for re-election in 1968. This time as governor, he took his office on the road. He had this bus that he loved to go out and invite people to come in and have kind of one-on-one sessions with him if they wanted. And again, it was this human connection that his mother had taught him and that he put so much value on that helped him to win re-election in 1968. However, it was by a closer margin than he won in 66, and his popularity was beginning to fade. The novelty of having a Rockefeller in the governor's office was beginning to wear off, and the Democratic legislature was just refusing to cooperate with him. Many of the reforms and the philosophies that he embraced, they also embraced. They just couldn't allow themselves to support a Republican governor. And so he had a tough time in the 1969 session. His focus was on tax reform. He really believed that we had to increase taxes in Arkansas before we could invest in ourselves. But unfortunately, Arkansans didn't have much of an appetite for increasing taxes, and neither did the General Assembly, all of whom were going to run for re-election in 1968. So he made some strides in changing state government, all those things we talked about with prison reform, education, government, highway safety, transparency, and he really had a commitment to racial equality. Unfortunately, he was limited sometimes in what he could really do to change the attitudes of Arkansans. In fact, when he held the only memorial service in the South for Martin Luther King Jr. after his assassination, he received letters from Republicans in Arkansas who said, "I voted for you last time, I won't vote for you again." And so he took an extraordinarily courageous stand for what he knew was right. And for a number of factors wasn't able to get his entire platform enacted. But what he did, which was really amazing, and I think the most significant part of his political legacy, is that his progressive politics and his transformative style of governing set the stage for the future in Arkansas. It was in 1970 when he ran for re-election, and by the way, he said in 1968 when he was re-elected he would not run for a third term. It's unclear to me why he made that promise, but after the 69 session he was determined to run again because he hadn't been able to enact his tax reform package. And he thought that if he gave up, that everything he had done to build the Republican Party and the Republican presence in Arkansas would be all for naught. But unfortunately, he wasn't able to make any headway. There was a brilliant, young, articulate lawyer from Charleston who challenged him in 1970, a man named Dale Bumpers, who would defeat him in his bid for re-election. Now, ironically, Dale Bumpers in the Democratic legislature would end up passing Governor Rockefeller's tax reform package in 1971, mostly in the same format that he had proposed it. So he laid the way for transformative and progressive politics in the South. Rex Nelson is with us today, who writes often about politics in Arkansas and has written about Winthrop's transformative vision before. Many people say if we hadn't had Winthrop Rockefeller, we wouldn't have had Dale Bumpers, we wouldn't have had David Pryor, we wouldn't have had Bill Clinton. And so his legacy was really to take a stand. When someone says it can't be done, to do it, to take a stand and to draw attention, shine a light on the things that are not working, to get people together and collaborate and talk about what it is that we can do to make our state a better place. After 1971, when Winthrop left the governor's office in January, he very briefly thought about a career, not a career, but a work in public service by gathering former governors together and working in this collaborative way to think about how they could contribute to policy development. But unfortunately, in the fall of 1972, he was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. It was a very aggressive cancer. He that winter was very harsh, so he went to his Palm Springs home and passed away on February 22nd, 1973. His son, Winthrop Paul, and their family took up residence in the estate, and still on the estate on Petit Jean is a family home for the Rockefellers. His legacy, though, did not die with him. And that's what is so amazing about Winthrop Rockefeller, is that the work that he did continues to live on. He left the bulk of his estate to his charitable trust with the instructions that it be used to improve Arkansas, to help us see the potential that he knew that we had to prosper in a way that he knew that we could. And so the foundation that bears his name today works to give grants and to improve the lives of Arkansans in the areas of economic development, education, and economic, racial, and social justice. Windrock International, which is located here in Little Rock, furthers the governor's belief in sustainable agriculture, clean energy, and development across the world. The Arkansas Arts Center, although it doesn't bear his name, owes its foundation and existence to Governor Rockefeller and Jeanette for helping and believing that we should expand access to the arts to all Arkansans. And there are numerous philanthropic efforts ripples that are still making an impact in Arkansas today. Now, as for the legacy, not the least of those organizations is the one that I'm proud to be a part of, the Winthrop Rockefeller Institute. We are the only Winthrop Rockefeller entity that is located on Petit Jean Mountain. Our offices are on the former cattle farm of the governor with those iconic twin silos still standing as a landmark to the past. My office is in the place we call the East Barn. We come out of the office every day, we can hear the cows. It's really a beautiful, serene, productive energy that you can't replicate anywhere. And we are helping to perpetuate the governor's legacy by inviting people to come to Petit Jean, to the place that he loved, to learn about him, and most importantly, to collaborate the way that he collaborated when he was here. We believe in our educational programming, just like Winthrop Rockefeller did, that no problem is too big for us to solve, and that Arkansas has great and enormous potential that we can recognize if we work together. And so our programs bring people to the mountain of all walks of life, all different political and philosophical views, to talk about how we can solve problems together. And that is how we perpetuate his legacy, in addition to telling his story in the way that I did today. So I want to, I think we have Leah, am I okay on time? This is a picture of the Institute as it stands today. It looks a little bit different than when it was Windrock Farms. We have about 10,000 visitors a year that come to the Winthrop Rockefeller Institute. If you're not one of them, we invite you to be. We have a legacy gallery devoted to his life where you can learn all about what it meant to grow up as a Rockefeller and his contributions to Arkansas. And I've brought with me today a little video. Daniel, let's see if I get it right.
At the heart of the mission of the Winthrop Rockefeller Institute is the legacy of a remarkable man. Winthrop Rockefeller came to Arkansas in 1953, having spent his first 40 years working in the Texas oil fields, serving in the Army during World War II, and helping manage family business interests in New York. He found a new purpose in Arkansas, first in building Windrock Farms, a state-of-the-art cattle ranch with educational outreach, and later in his economic, philanthropic, and political contributions to the natural state.
So when Governor Rockefeller arrived in the state of Arkansas, he found a state that really struggled to believe in itself. And he recognized the untapped potential, the amount of resources here in the state. Through his unique experiences during his formative years, my grandfather was able to leverage his talents, his efforts, his resources, and the family name in order to make significant reforms across the state. And as a result, Arkansas became a leader across the South as well as nationally.
I think the state of Arkansas is a real beneficiary from having had Winthrop Rockefeller as his leader. He was a leader ahead of his time. He was a leader who cared about and worked with people to achieve the goals of the time. I think his legacy is a testament to the type of leader he was in civil rights, in education, in reforming the penitentiary system in the state of Arkansas, and he did it with people and for people.
One of Winthrop Rockefeller's greatest contributions to Arkansas was employing what has been called the Rockefeller ethic. This practice involved approaching every potential problem or opportunity by bringing the foremost experts to the table with a cohort of good thinkers and practitioners. Together, they would have meaningful dialogue about what was needed to address a particular issue. During the 20 years he lived atop Petit Jean Mountain, he hosted more than 200 meetings where he convened the best and brightest leaders, thinkers, and scholars to address key issues facing Arkansas. The Winthrop Rockefeller Institute perpetuates that legacy by fostering meaningful dialogue, advancing important ideas and research, and searching for solutions to pressing issues facing the state, the region, and the country today.
When Winthrop Rockefeller was named the first chair of the Arkansas Industrial Development Commission in 1956, it was then that the state saw the first glimpse of the Rockefeller ethic. His first act as chair was to identify the foremost expert on this topic and bring them to the mountain along with his fellow commissioners, and it was here that they wrote the first economic development plan for the state of Arkansas.
The Institute works with various partners on a wide range of programs.
The Rockefeller ethic is at the heart of what we do, and it is really what makes us unique. Like Governor Rockefeller, we believe that there is power in bringing people together and searching for solutions in a collaborative way. And that is what our programs do. We bring people together in that structured environment and provide an opportunity for them to ask really big questions about the challenges facing Arkansas and our country. Our goal in that process is to make sure that we're bringing the right people to the table, that we're asking the right questions, and that we're ensuring that collaborative environment. We bring our partners and participants together in this place where Governor Rockefeller imagined a better future for Arkansas. And together, little by little, we seek to answer those big questions and make a difference in the world the way Winthrop Rockefeller did.
As a fully operational conference center, the Institute provides a place for organizations to hold meetings, conferences, and retreats. The Institute's unique setting provides a one-of-a-kind experience for groups looking to learn, reflect, develop, and plan for the future.
There is a productive energy that permeates our pastoral campus. The atmosphere here is one where you can focus and be mindfully engaged on your work and the people that you're working with. We pride ourselves in the excellent service that we provide to our customers and our partners so that they can do the work that they came here to do.
I've got 5 chancellors and 16 CEOs on my Arkansas Research Alliance board, and I have good meetings on their campuses, but there's something really about getting away. It's a unique place, I think, in the fact that it is almost a pastoral setting where you kind of go into a different mode of thinking. And so I consider it really a kind of a thinking place.
Winthrop Rockefeller once said that he hoped to be remembered as a catalyst for positive change in Arkansas. The institute that bears his name has embraced that legacy, and we hope it's a legacy that's as inspiring to others as it is to us. Winthrop Rockefeller came to a mountain and changed the world around him. We invite you to do the same.
It is many things to many people. To me, it's a way of life, and I like it.
So that's a glimpse of who we are and what we do, and we invite you to come be a part of it. As we say in the video, we hope we're transforming Arkansas the way that Winthrop Rockefeller did and keeping his spirit alive. And I hope that today that you've learned a little more about his story. And so with that, I will conclude, and I know that we're right at the time, but if there's any questions that I can try to answer, I'm happy to do so. Nobody? Come on, Rex, I know you've got something. Don't stunt me. Well, it's really an honor to be here and to talk about Winthrop Rockefeller. And again, I invite you all to come to the mountain and see us anytime. And thanks for being here today. So, all right.